When my girlfriend and I first moved into an apartment complex filled with quaint fourplex buildings, we were ecstatic. It felt like a fresh start, a new chapter in our lives. Soon after moving in, we got our first dog. For the initial few weeks, everything seemed perfect. Our little family was adjusting beautifully, and the days were filled with joy and laughter. But about a month after getting the dog, an eerie shift began to occur. One seemingly ordinary day, while I was walking our dog outside, a little boy who looked about 7 years old approached us. He introduced himself as Sam and sweetly asked if he could pet the dog. I didn't see any harm in it and agreed. Then he asked if he could hold her, and thinking it harmless, I said yes. But as soon as Sam picked up our dog, he squeezed her so hard that she let out a sharp squeal of pain. I was taken aback and immediately told him that what he did was not okay and that he shouldn't treat animals like that. Little did I know, this unsettling encounter was only the beginning of a series of increasingly disturbing events. A few days later, while I was home alone, there was a knock on the door. It was Sam again, asking if the puppy could come out to play. I told him she was sleeping, and then he asked for some candy. We kept a candy bowl on the coffee table in plain sight, so I said sure, but told him to make sure it was okay with his mother before coming back. This happened 3 or 4 more times over the next few weeks, each time with Sam showing up at our door, asking for candy. Then, one day around lunchtime, Sam appeared at our door holding a yellow wiffle ball bat. He asked for candy again. When I told him I was all out and he should go home, his demeanor changed dramatically. He stared at me with an unnerving intensity and said, "You best have candy when I come back or we are going to get you." The eerie part was, he was alone. I quickly closed the door and moved the candy bowl to the next room, out of sight. But within 15 minutes, I heard the door open and the storm door slam shut. Sam walked in without hesitation, took some candy from the new spot as if he knew exactly where it was, said nothing, and left. I chased after him, telling him not to come back, and asked where he lived. He pointed to an apartment, and I made a mental note to check it out later with my girlfriend. When she got home, we both walked down to the apartment Sam had pointed to. But when we got there, the place was empty. According to the office, that unit had been vacant for some time, and any tenant who moved in never stayed for more than a few months before breaking their lease. In the following weeks, our dog and cat started behaving strangely. The dog would sit and growl at the corner behind the front door for hours, fixated on something unseen. The cat would go crazy if any doors were shut, scratching at them and shoving his face into them, desperate to open them. About 2 months after our initial encounter with Sam, my girlfriend and I were driving home late at night, around 11 p.m. As we turned the corner near our apartment, there was Sam, sitting on a big wheel, staring directly at us. He pointed at us and followed us with his finger as we rounded the turn. When we parked the car and looked around, he was gone. We have since moved to a new location, but for the year we stayed at that apartment, our dog and cat never stopped acting out, hating doors and corners. We often heard creaking doors and saw eerie reflections in the windows. Even now, I get goosebumps just thinking about it. It was, without a doubt, the creepiest experience of my life. This chilling tale unfolded at an ancient farmhouse in the remote wilderness of rural Norway, a place steeped in lore and whispered tales of hauntings. This old house belonging to my now ex-wife's family stood vacant most of the year, serving as her uncle's summer cottage. Desperate for a place to stay, we moved in, hoping the cozy setting nestled in a valley by the fjord would provide a peaceful retreat. We even brought our beloved cat along from the US, making it feel like home. For the first couple of months, everything seemed perfectly normal. I cherished the serene beauty of the place. But then, the whispers began. At first, they were faint, indistinguishable murmurs that sounded like women talking somewhere in the house. It was easy enough to dismiss these as mere figments of our imagination. However, the eerie voices soon became more persistent and unsettling. One night, around 3 a.m., the tranquility was shattered. The lights in the kitchen flickered on, and the unmistakable aroma of food cooking wafted through the air. We could hear women conversing as if they were preparing a meal. Now her family was known for their unannounced visits, but at such an ungodly hour, this was highly unusual. Anger initially overtook my fear as I marched toward the kitchen, determined to confront the intruders. But as I opened the door, the voices abruptly ceased. The lights blazed brightly, the oven was still warm, and the tantalizing smell of food lingered, yet the kitchen was empty. From that night on, the disturbances grew more sinister. Blood-curdling screams echoed from the cellar and the attic in the dead of night, and our cat, usually calm, began acting increasingly agitated. She would stare into empty corners, hiss at invisible entities, and chase after things that weren't there. It was as if she could see something we couldn't. The final straw came one night, again around 3 a.m. I was jolted awake by a horrifying screech from the living room. Rushing to investigate, I couldn't find the source immediately. Then I saw her, our white, fluffy, blue-eyed cat, defying gravity, standing on the ceiling. Her eyes glowed red in the moonlight as she howled like a creature from a nightmare. My wife, drawn by the noise, came out and screamed in terror at the sight. The cat's eyes locked onto us, and she uttered in a raspy old woman's voice, "Get out," in Norwegian. The glow faded from her eyes, and she fell to the floor, resuming her normal behavior as if nothing had happened. That night, we fled to my ex-wife's parents' house, too terrified to spend another moment in that accursed farmhouse. The following day, we moved out and away from that area for good. The experience left an indelible mark on us both. To this day, the memory of that night haunts my dreams, a constant reminder of the terror we endured in that haunted house. When my mom married my stepdad, we moved into his small brick house in a rundown town in Texas. Despite the less-than-ideal location, we were all adjusting well and getting along. I was especially relieved that my stepbrother and I were hitting it off, much to the delight of our parents. Life seemed almost perfect, except for the terrifying occurrences that began disturbing my nights. I started waking up in the middle of the night, only to see someone, a man, I thought, standing ominously in the doorway. All I could make out was the silhouette of a large figure with a wide-brimmed hat dominating the doorway. It was so peculiar because, despite the pitch darkness of the house, this shadowy figure stood out distinctly. I could feel his gaze fixed on me, and he would raise a finger to his lips, making a chilling shh sound. Then, in a low, almost mocking tone, he would say, "Boo," as if screaming it, yet my stepbrother, who shared the room with me, never stirred. When I asked him if he ever heard or saw anything strange, he always denied it. Terrified, I would pull the blanket over my head, shivering, straining my ears for any sign of movement or other sounds. Fortunately, nothing happened, and after a few minutes of paralyzing fear, I would fall back asleep. For about 2 weeks, everything was quiet. But then, one night, as I tossed and turned, struggling to fall asleep, my mind drifted back to the haunting figure. It was around 1 a.m., and the more I thought about the shadow, the more I scared myself. I worked up the courage to peek out from under the covers, but the doorway was clear. Relieved, I burrowed back under my blankets. Suddenly, I felt the covers being slowly pulled off me. I grabbed at them, but whatever or whoever was tugging was too strong. In a panic, I glanced over to make sure it wasn't my stepbrother playing a prank, but he was sound asleep in his bed. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. Paralyzed with fear, I watched as my covers began to rise from the floor, taking the shape of a person underneath them. It was like a scene from a horror movie, but this was all too real, and I was absolutely terrified. Desperation fueled my scream, and I let out a piercing cry, loud enough to wake the dead. My stepbrother jolted awake and saw the apparition under the covers. He scrambled to turn on the lights, and as soon as the room was illuminated, the covers dropped to the floor in a heap, as if no one had ever been there. We sat in stunned silence, our hearts pounding, unwilling to close our eyes for the rest of the night. At the first light of dawn, my stepbrother wasted no time in telling his dad what we had experienced. The look of pure horror on his face was undeniable as he recounted our terrifying ordeal. A week later, we moved to a new house, barely sleeping during that final week in the haunted home. Thankfully, nothing terrifying happened in those last few days, but the memory of that night has haunted me ever since. I will never forget the terror that gripped me, nor the shadowy figure that turned my nights into a living nightmare.